Oh boy, they want me to run a carbon budget for our new film production. We are shooting in a German forest, in the Austrian Alps, and at the Croatian seaside. So I need to chase departments across 3 co-production partners in 3 different countries, and I need to prepare the official reports for each national funding institution. And to be honest, I have no clue what kind of this hotel invoice or this gas station receipt actually means in carbon emissions. Well, producing sustainable does not need to be a data nightmare. Let me show you how you can actually collect all your activity data across productions and run your CO₂e budgets more efficiently, especially on international co-productions. So here's another video for all your hardworking people on set and at the production office, and today's topic is green film production and CO₂e budgets. All right, my friends, welcome. Well, this topic seems to be awfully kind of complicated. That's why I said I need an expert. So welcome Justin from our new partner KlimAktiv. And Justin really knows more about all this stuff than I do. Justin, you're the production manager for audiovisual media with KlimAktiv. What is KlimAktiv? Who are you guys?
Well, hi Florian, thanks for having me. KlimAktiv is a consultancy and a software company, and we are specialized in carbon emission accounting and in climate strategy consulting. And we've been doing that for over 20 years now. And our clients are companies, individuals, and also film productions and television productions.
And I guess you guys have quite some experience with carbon emission calculators in this industry, right?
Yes, we do. We have been providing a carbon calculator for film and television productions for a couple of years now, and it's the main or standard tool in Germany.
It's a green shooting tool.
Exactly.
All right, cool. Great. So, I mean, carbon emissions and, putting all these receipts and data into carbon emissions and creating a budget, like, why does this matter nowadays for film productions or media productions in general?
Well, first of all, climate change needs to be tackled. This is clear. And in the last couple of years, in recent years, there have been quite some initiatives or regulatory initiatives in Germany and in other countries as well that say, well, film and television production does emit lots of emissions and we have to do something about it. And so reducing carbon emissions starts with budgeting and tracking, and then we can reduce.
There are a lot of different standards across Europe, not only like in Germany, there's also like Austria, Switzerland, of course, France with EcoProd, there's of course Albert as a pioneer in the UK. So there are a lot of different standards out there, but it's always the common goal to kind of track carbon emissions in film productions. And of course, then, as you say, eventually reduce them and just be aware of what are the biggest drivers in carbon emissions. So we thought together, maybe we can integrate carbon emission tracking and budgeting in a tool like Yamdu directly in the production workflows so that you can actually still react while you're still on production and immediately see what all that means in carbon emissions, and also to handle like this topic we're tackling here with the international co-productions in the various countries where maybe there might be different emissions for hotel overnight stays, for the energy consumption locations and so on, so that you can really consider like the national specifications and the national standards when it comes to carbon emissions. So Let's take a look what we've done. All right. So in Yamdu, we created a new area, obviously called sustainability. Here you can create different scenarios. So a scenario can be either like an actual or estimate. So why does this matter? What is the difference between like a target budget or like the running budget?
In many regulations, for example, in Germany or in Austria, you have to do 2 budgets, one before production starts in order to estimate emissions to get a rough number. And then after production has finished, you have to do the actual balance, which contains all the emissions based on your actual data from the production.
So like when it comes to media productions, what are we talking about? Like how much are carbon emissions actually?
Yeah, there are lots of areas in media production where we have emissions, and they can be small or big depending on your production. there's of course lots of big productions that have lots of travel, lots of energy consumption, and they can have carbon emissions in the range of a couple of tons, or maybe hundreds or even thousands of tons, metric tons of carbon emissions. And then there are small productions, maybe like a documentary or a TV show, that maybe only have a couple of 100 kilograms of carbon emissions. It depends on your production type.
All right. Speaking of metric tons, so as you know, Yamdu is an international tool, and I will show you later how you can also change your units, for example, to the imperial system. But the carbon budget will always be shown in kilograms. Why is that?
When we track carbon emissions, in this case, a film or TV production is a product carbon footprint. We do a product carbon footprint. There are some standards dealing with product carbon footprints that set out rules, what you have to account for and what not, and stuff like that. And there are mainly two standards, international standards, that we are using for this. One is the ISO 14067, and the other one is the GHG protocol, which is the most commonly known standard for product carbon footprinting, I think.
So he knows his standards, right? All right, let's move on here. If I create a new scenario, as you can see, I can choose like what calculator profile should be used for this particular scenario. And we can already see like the German, Italian, Austrian, and Swiss one, they're actually based on the KlimAktiv tools, right?
Exactly. If you were to use our green shooting calculator, you would see exactly the same activities and exactly the same carbon emission factors.
Okay, so that's cool, right? No matter if you use like the own KlimAktiv tools or if you're using the same thing in Yamdu, you always get the very same results, and you can actually enter also exactly the same activity data.
That's right.
And then you can see here, I can also choose the PEAR calculator by the Sustainable Entertainment Alliance, like the American, Canadian, Australian system, and then also the new and upcoming media carbon calculator, the new European calculator. It's another project where we
have been working together on that one as well.
Exactly. And then you can also choose international co-production with multiple calculator profiles. So I will show you in a second how you can use this to actually run one carbon budget for your entire production, but then kind of split it between various calculators. So you can either say Yamdu should only use one standard, for example, just follow the green shooting or the German standard, or you actually want to mix your calculator profiles. So, of course, immediately we see like an empty scenario, right? So that's why I will switch back to a budget already created. By the way, you always have like a tile view, you have like a list view, and you can also, rearrange things here, but let's not dive into this. Let's go right into our demo summary. So what you see here is you already see the splitter between like the Croatian part when it comes to carbon emissions, the Austrian part and the German part. And then you also see kind of where those carbon emissions are currently allocated in what categories and areas. So I assume, Justin, there are kind of different drivers, right, in a film production or a media production that are kind of very high or very low in carbon emissions. So what are the kind of biggest drivers?
Yes, I mean, it always depends on your type of production, of course, but we see there are two main categories that are the hotspots. And these are energy carbon emissions, so from electricity consumption or heating. And the other one is travel and accommodation. So traveling by car and by plane and by train and so on produces lots of carbon emissions.
I guess so. So good I had those examples right here, right? Hotels, accommodation, and obviously also fuel. So, all right. So we see here also in the summary that we can then see more details like from those overall categories. And we always see like our total emissions down below. So here I'm currently at 31 metric tons of carbon emissions, but this is kind of my running budget. So I'm just, moving along, right? By the way, you can also filter here on top, for example, to just see Austrian carbon emissions or just German carbon emissions. And then obviously this will change your summary. But again, this is just a filter and just is kind of the view you have right in here. So now let's dive into the various areas of where we can actually enter activity data. And let's not forget all those receipts and all that stuff needs to be right in here. So let's first go into studios and locations. So here you can see I already have 3 locations and they're located in Croatia. So that's why, because I have the international profile active here, I have the media carbon calculator. You could always immediately switch your calculators right in here, but that's correct, right? For Croatia, I want to use the media carbon calculator. But what you can also do, instead of punching all that data in manually, like in a spreadsheet or so, you can import from other areas of Yamdu. So let's do this here and let's get the data for the fixed locations, right? Ta-da! And that's, it's all here. And as you can see, as Yamdu knows the location and the country and the address and all that, it's also allocating automatically the specific calculator profile for this specific area. For example, here the Austrian calculator profile, the German one, or for the Croatian locations, again, kind of the media carbon calculator. So that's kind of how we can mix actually different calculator profiles. What do you think?
I think it's great, because then you have all the countries in one place and you don't have to fill out different calculators or different tools for each country. It's all in one place.
So let's maybe talk about like all those differences and nuances and why this actually matters. So why does this make your carbon budget potentially more precise? What could be the differences between different countries?
Yeah, there are lots of differences between countries when it comes to carbon emissions, especially here in energy. There's electricity consumption, and the electricity mix is very different in different countries. For example, some countries might use more coal in their energy generation.
Let's hope not so much in the future.
Some countries have a higher percentage of renewable energies, and depending on your special mix in your country, emissions can vary drastically. And so the goal would be that we have a greener electricity mix, but of course we as a production cannot choose the electricity mix of the country we're shooting in, right?
It's the most precise way to actually consider those national differences. So if it comes like to a location, like you said, for the energy area, or also here for the heating area, but let's stay maybe in power, we can actually choose different things, right? Like the power type, is it being on site, and what is the source? Is it renewable energy, or is it kind of non-renewable energy? But then as we scroll down, we come to something where it says priority 1, right? And then we have, for example, the calculation by external emissions, but then below you can see there is calculation by consumption. And as I already have entered something before here, it has pre-populated the kilowatt hours under consumption. And as we go on scrolling down, there are also more priorities. So how does this work? What's kind of the difference of the activity data I'm entering?
Yeah, so our goal is always to get the most precise and accurate data that we can, in order to get the most precise and accurate emissions in the calculation. And for example, if your supplier provides you with an actual number of carbon emissions, that would be our first priority, and then we can enter that on top. If we don't have that, that's totally fine. Then we can maybe read the meter and just enter the meter reading, and then we get all kilowatt hours consumed, and that's also totally fine, because we can calculate from that. And then further down below in the priority list is calculation based on cost. Cost is not always as accurate. It can be a good proxy.
I see here, for example, like calculation by costs with the German profile is actually not possible for location.
For example, when it comes to electricity prices can be very different throughout the year, throughout the day even. So it's difficult to assume carbon emissions based on cost. And that's why we don't offer it. But you can do it maybe with another profile.
But then there's a fourth thing.
And the fourth thing, exactly, if you don't have any idea at all, if you maybe just know what type of location you have, or if you're going to have high or low energy consumption because you have lots of lights, then you can do an assumption based on these parameters to get a rough estimate. This would be great for the estimate scenario. Later on, if you have a meter reading, that would be better for the actual scenario.
So maybe at this point you might ask yourself, where does all this data come from that he just imported, right? So maybe let's switch to another Yamdu area called locations and sets. So basically you have an overview of all your narrative sets that might come out of your script, for example. And then you have the filming locations of the real world. That could be, of course, like a studio, But of course, it could be just like a regular filming location. Whatever it might be, like a location manager, like a coordinator, can already punch in a lot of data, right? While you're, for example, still scouting. This could be the address, and it shows you the map and, who's our contact person and photos and all that stuff. But as you can see, there is also an area for sustainability. And there you can maybe enter things that you already know early on. So for example, what kind of power is supplied on site? Is it from renewable energy? Is it like conventional energy or non-renewable, let's say? Or for example, for the assumptions, the area, like in square feet or square meters, as you've seen before, together with your shooting days or your estimated shooting days, that's already kind of activity data that can then be reused in the sustainability area. And we also see here things like waste information. And I think that's also related to the ecological minimum standards, right? Where you also have to show like waste separation was possible or not. And then maybe, as we see later on, for some things, you might also need to justify like why certain things could not be aligned with those standards. And then, of course, you can also always add activities manually. If you cannot import them from, for example, the location area, you can also type them in, like, for example, a restaurant, right? And we say we also have like as you remember, our Austrian part, right? We shoot like on location in a restaurant in Vienna. So let's do this. And then again, we can kind of, enter like the power, for example, and is it from renewable energy? But we could also like choose something like a diesel generator. And then immediately I have that comment field. So obviously I need to, again, justify, like, for example, that the nearest power drop was like, I don't know, like 400 meters away or something. So I guess generators are not ideal, right?
Yes, generators are a main source of emissions because they burn a lot of diesel. So they are inefficient, and that is why we have to reduce the usage of diesel generators. And for example, in Germany, we have the ecological standards, and they set out very strict rules regarding the use of diesel generators. And in most cases, they are not allowed at all. And there are some restrictions or some exceptions where you can say, okay, if there's no proper grid connection within a couple of 100 meters, then it's okay. But then you have to do biodiesel or HVO generators, or you have to do a particle filter.
So there are great alternatives.
Yes,
right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Or there are also battery packs that you can use, which are most times battery packs are more than sufficient for a regular shooting day. Because nowadays we have lots of LED instead of tungsten lights, so they consume less power. And if it's only for charging camera batteries, then a big battery pack will be more than sufficient instead of a generator.
All right, so make sure you just check in with your equipment rental house and your suppliers, because, as Justin says, there might be alternatives that you're not even aware of. And here you can immediately see the difference in carbon emissions, and they can actually be a huge difference. All right, so we already talked a lot about locations and stuff, but here you can see with those little tooltips, there are also the sources are shown. So what is kind of the background information? But maybe Justin can tell us what's the background of all this.
Yes, so calculating carbon emissions is in theory really simple. You just take an activity, for example, a couple of liters of diesel, and then you multiply that with an emission factor. But the emission factor is hard to get because you can't find them on the street. So we've put quite some research and modeling into creating or gathering these emission factors, and we gather them from different sources. We do our own modeling with our in-house R&D team, and of course they are all thoroughly researched. They are based on reputable sources, for example, like the International Energy Agency or national environmental agencies in Germany, for example. And so when it comes to the different countries, of course, we take sources from different countries regarding their electricity mixes and so on.
Right. Then we can also click on those subcategories like production offices. And again, you see, I might have production offices in Munich, in Vienna, in Dubrovnik. And then, of course, I can also allocate, for example, the energy or heating, like according to those specific areas. And then the same, of course, for post-production. But there you can also see there are a lot of options, actually. And I can also punch in things like GPUs and CPUs, and how would I ever know what I punch in here?
Well, as I said earlier, everything depends on your type of production. And there might be some productions, for example, a VFX or computer animated film, and they are running their own data center or their own server farm, and maybe they know that they have 1,200 CPUs running in the background. But of course, if you have a small production or if you are in a post-production studio with a couple of workstations and monitors, you can also enter that.
All right, I'm glad, right? So I know we are prepared for huge visual productions, but also I can just punch in my little workstation with 2 monitors. So that's great, very flexible. All right, let's move on. And there's even home office. I like that very much. So I think that's one of the new factors, right? That was just added recently.
Exactly. So if you are working from home, or if you do telework, or however you might call it, then we can also account for that, because especially since the pandemic, many people work from home. And to account for that as well, we have included this emission factor here.
All right, very cool. So let's then move on to like the big, I guess, driving force of travel, right?
Yes.
So here you can see in the first tab, accommodation, so kind of hotels. It's not only hotels, I think it's also apartments and large houses and stuff that you could consider potentially. But guess what? Of course, you can again kind of import data from a different area of Yamdu. So before I do this, let me show you like the travel section of Yamdu. There you can kind of manage like the itineraries, kind of the journeys of your cast and crew members. And this is more targeting like travel coordinators, production coordinators, etc. And you see like for, your various crew and cast members, you can do different legs like, flights and train rides and hotel and overnight stays and all that. And you always have this nice overview of all the journeys. For example, if I say, well, this particular crew member needs to go from Innsbruck Central Station to Munich Central Station on a train, in this case, you can see that it automatically calculates the distance like for this particular train ride. And then for the hotel stay, for example, this particular crew member is staying a couple of numbers of overnight stays. And then for everything, you can also add like the receipts, like the invoices, the booking confirmations, and all that can then be reused later on in our sustainability tool. So let's go back to our carbon emissions scenario. Let's click on travel again, accommodation, and now let's actually run the importer. Here I want everything for my approved journeys. And as you can see, it will not overwrite everything. It will just update because everything that's, for example, already approved or has already been entered won't be entered twice. And again, of course, as we know the addresses of those hotels and where they're located, Yamdu automatically suggests like a national calculator profile. But again, as you can see, you can, of course, easily switch this. And then, of course, we also can consider the various hotel types and accommodation types, like a luxury hotel or also like a hostel. And I guess there's a huge difference, right?
Of course, there are differences. So you see, a luxury hotel, we have much higher carbon emissions because there's more space. Probably there's a spa within the hotel and so on that uses energy and so on. And especially the rule is the more people you get in a small space, the higher the efficiency. So if you rent an apartment where you can put 4 people, that will be much more efficient than booking one luxury suite for each actor, for example.
That absolutely makes sense. Well, does this mean you cannot book luxury hotels? Well, of course, probably it's also part of the contracts of various actors, or they need to fly business class or whatever. But I think this is very useful to actually create awareness and see the differences between those like alternatives that you might have when it comes to accommodation or traveling. And speaking of traveling, I think one really huge driving thing behind carbon emissions, unfortunately, is the flights.
Yes.
So as you can see here, I have, of course, a couple of commercial flights already entered, but I could also switch the type of activity, in this case, to a large private jet. And this will show me a warning. Why? Because I have the German calculator profile active, so the green shooting calculator. No private jets?
No private jets in Germany, because in our ecological standards, it's actually forbidden to use any private jets except when they are within the picture in the actual film.
And by the way, there's always, like for all types of vehicles or transportation, there is also the option to say, is this in camera or not? For example, also if you have a very old car that obviously, you know, burns like 20 liters of diesel for 100 kilometers or something, but you actually need it in camera, then you can of course justify this. But still, no private jets.
No private jets, yeah. Because the emissions for private jets are much, much higher than for regular flights.
What is much higher?
Much higher. For example, if you take a private jet compared to economy class seat on a regular airline, it's about 14 times higher.
14
times.
14 times.
And maybe compared to a train ride on the same distance, that would be up to 50 times higher.
Yeah. All right. So for our little crew member, there's no private jet from Innsbruck to Munich, okay? He has to take the train. Agreed?
Exactly.
All right. Cool. But as you can see, like if you switch between different calculator profiles, Yamdu will also notify you if something, for example, can simply not considered under a certain national standard, and you always understand why certain activity data can simply not be entered. And then, of course, let's go to ground transportation. And here you can see I have already entered 2 car rides, always from the Munich International Airport to kind of downtown Munich. But for one, for example, I actually do have carbon emissions in kilograms, but here for the other ones, I do not have a result. So let's click here on the details. And then if we scroll down, we see, well, both have kind of the distance, and it's also used for the calculation, but we also need to enter the average consumption. So again, this obviously is also part of the green shooting calculator, and it's simply required in addition to the distance.
Exactly. So if you know the average consumption of your car, that's fine. You can enter the distance and the average consumption. But if you don't know, then it would be probably best to just go with the fuel receipt, because that is a higher priority anyway.
True.
And that would be the better option in your case.
Absolutely. And I think it also does not need to be like for every single ride. You can also just collect all the fuel receipts as what you've seen before here, and then just keep adding them up, right?
Exactly.
And of course, then I immediately get a result. And then I also want to click on import activities to also get all the ground transportation information, in this case for persons. And voila, here I have like all my activity data entered. And again, for example, for train rides in Croatia or something, or in Austria, it always kind of takes the national calculator, in this case for Croatia, the media carbon calculator. And then I also see all the details. By the way, for this train ride, I also can click here and I see the receipt, right? That's what I told you before. So you also get like all the travel documents from the travel section, which actually matters to actually then say, well, this, for example, is then approved. I have the correct receipt here. By the way, you don't have to do this individually. You can also bulk edit this, and for example, for various areas like assigning a calculator profile, a country, but also for the status itself, you can set, for example, everything to approved. So let's move on to catering. So for catering, I have actually entered the catering information per shooting week. Obviously, we start in Germany, then we go on to Austria, and then to Croatia. And then I added all the meals, and I divided them by, let's say, omnivore, like a mixed meals, and then also vegetarian and vegan. And here again, we can see that I think the KlimAktiv calculators have a lot of options. The media carbon calculator, not so much, but you do have a lot of options.
So there are a lot of options to make catering more environmentally friendly. For example, you can have seasonal or regional food
and suppliers that are
exactly
around. Yeah.
But one thing that really cuts it is reducing meat in your diet.
Which is not a bad idea anyways, I guess. Yeah.
If you switch from a meat based diet to a vegetarian or even a vegan based diet, you could potentially save half the emissions or even more.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. That's cool, right? And it's not so hard to do nowadays.
Yes.
Yeah. All right, now let's move to departments and the materials. And as you can see here, all my entries here are mostly around set construction. So they come from the production design and art department. And there are a lot of options, like, for example, timber and chipboard and styrofoam. And I guess a lot of things that are also not good for the environment in general, I assume.
Yes, exactly.
So, by the way, as I said before, you can always switch your units, also like from kilograms to pounds, or from square meters to square feet. So no worries if you also need to use this, for example, in the US or in the UK. But here, if I scroll down, I have something interesting. I have a little comment here. So if I click on the comment, I actually can see that my colleague, Mick, has informed me that we've been able to reuse some of the materials. And I guess reusing stuff is the best thing you can do, right?
Yes, buying as few things as possible in order to reduce your emissions is always a good idea.
All right. So he tells me that like the linoleum, like we could reuse from the King's Hall set, here also for the Ferry Ramses set. So that's great. Thanks, Mick, for letting me know. That's a good thing. Thanks for taking that in mind. And what I can do now is in my status bar, I can click Omit. And you see now the CO₂e result is omitted. So it's in parentheses. I basically say I don't want to count this twice. And that's how you can easily omit certain activities across your carbon budget. So it still stays here and everybody understands what has been happening, but it does not count towards your CO₂e total result. By the way, CO₂e, why E?
Well, the E stands for equivalence, because actually we always talk about carbon or carbon dioxide, CO₂, but actually there are more greenhouse gases that are bad for our climate. For example, methane, which is also a lot worse than actual carbon emissions. And you can calculate the carbon equivalence, CO₂e, from these other greenhouse gases and combine it into one big number that is more comparable compared to always citing carbon dioxide, methane, N2O, and so on and so on.
I learned a lot already, so I think I feel way more comfortable now. So let's move on and go back to the summary. You can also filter by country. And then, for example, we only have the Austrian results. And, for example, only the German results. And then I have all. Again, what I can also do, I can compare this with the target budget. And here is my Love at Sunset target and estimated budget. Well, I think here I just put in way too much things, right? But I think I also was playing around with the private chat. So I guess that's my problem. So let's switch this back to the original summary we've been here. And let's now go to exports. So what you can do is also to export the entire project in one gigantic zip file, and it also creates like an Excel spreadsheet, and then also the individual files in the same structure as you have them here. And the great thing is that, as we've seen before, it follows this chart of account, right? So the chart of account is actually something you can edit yourself. And if you want, for example, the chart of account with those numbers to match your budget numbers, well, go for it, right? Ask accounting, and you can just align it with whatever the chart of account for your production or production company looks like. But the cool thing is that you can see that all the files, all the receipts will actually be renamed. Well, you still have the original file name, but it actually has then the kind of chart of account number at the beginning of the file name. And that way, I think the audit process is really kind of sped up a lot. So, and I think auditing all this is a thing, right?
It's a thing, exactly. For example, in Germany, we have this thing called Green Motion Label, which is a label that you can apply for when you comply with all of the ecological standards, and then you can put it in the end credits of your movie, for example, and it certifies that you are sustainable production. But in order to apply for this Green Motion Label, you have to go through a review, and then you will most likely use all of those receipts, and if you have them handy already, that's good for you.
It's also about reports, right? So
that's right.
You know, We Germans love reports, right? So let's click on export to generate a report, and let's choose the German calculator export, which is actually the green shooting report for the carbon budget. I think there are two different reports, right?
In order to receive film funding, for example, you have to do these carbon budgetings and you have to send them your reports. And then there's also the so-called green motion final report, where you have to tick which of these criteria from the ecological standards you have fulfilled and which not. And if you didn't fulfill some mandatory requirement, then you have to give an explanation, and you can export all these reports within Yamdu.
Yeah, that's cool, right? We've integrated them, and thanks for this partnership again. So because as you can see here, you just add the additional information that might be needed, also for the reference year, and kind of also if you want to compare your estimate or target budget against like this running or final budget. And then what's important, you can run this for all the countries where we have entered activity data. But as you can see down below here, of course, the German report will only consider activity data where we have actually the German calculator profile enabled, right? So it's automatically filtering this for you so that it's exactly the same result as you would enter it in the green shooting calculator.
Yes, and the report is also exactly the same one that you would get from our green shooting calculator. So you can just hand it into your film funding institution and they will accept it.
And as Justin has mentioned before, of course, it's exactly the same for the so-called final report in case you need that. And there's maybe some more information because I think there's also some sort of questionnaire that's needed, right?
As I mentioned before, you have to tick which of the mandatory and voluntary criteria you have fulfilled and which you didn't.
All right. Yeah, as we can see here, for example, maybe in Croatia, I needed to rent some cars that do not fulfill the German standards, but maybe there was no other option. At least I think I don't need to fulfill all of these topics, just most of them. And of course, you can always take a look at all the criteria at the link below in the description. And then under exports, you also find the official report according to the media carbon calculator, the tool provided by the European Commission. You just select another project type due to statistical purposes, and you need to select your primary production country. So in this case, we just want to run the report for Croatia, and we click here and we get the report. And as you can see, it's the official report by the European Commission, and all the results are neatly divided into the non-renewable activities and then their renewable alternatives for Croatia. All right, my friends, that's what you can do in Yamdu and actually together with all the add-ons from KlimAktiv. So, Justin, thank you so much for being here. And one last question. Do you think you work hard for the money?
I work so hard for the money.
I think we both work hard for the money. So if you think this video is useful, then please hit like and subscribe. And always remember, they really work hard for the money.